If you have your Bibles, would you take them out and turn with me to Romans chapter 1. Romans chapter 1, as we're picking up where we left off last week in our study in Walking with God. Now, as you're turning, let me remind you, as we've seen over the last several weeks, there are 5 major sections and 5 major themes to the book of Romans. The overall theme is walking with God. But in each one of these 5 sections, there is a different aspect of what it means to walk with God. And the first section is certainly, by far, the darkest of all of these themes, because Paul begins with this section in chapters 1 through 3 in the consequences of not walking with God. And in verse 18, and it's almost like a legal brief, he's presenting this case that God has against us. And there's a summary, there are charges, there is the judgments and the consequences that are all named in chapter 1. But the summary statement is in verse 18. It's very simply that God's anger towards sin is being revealed from heaven towards all of those who carelessly engage in the sinfulness of mankind. And this is true both individually and as cultures. Now, as you study through this section, you'll see that everything that's being presented is really centered around one crucial statement, and that's in verse 25. Where mankind exchanged or traded the truth of God for the lie. Now, in your translation, it probably says they traded for a lie. But if you understand the force of what Paul is communicating, it's more than just a lie. We didn't trade the truth of God for any old lie, but ultimately the great lie that our lives could be more complete and fulfilled without God than with Him. And we chose as individuals in Adam and as a culture to turn away from God, to suppress His truth, and to embrace the great lie that we can be happier, we can be more fulfilled, we can be more complete and have a greater sense of purpose and direction in our lives if we live on our own, if we are pursuing the teachings and the standards of our culture rather than God Himself. Now, this is so important, and I shared this with you last week. In order for us to fully understand where we're going today, we have to recognize this critical spiritual truth that whenever an individual person or as a culture, we trade the truth of God for the lie of Satan, that we can be more complete, fulfilled, and have a better existence outside of God and without Him than with Him. Sooner or later, that impacts everything about us, how we think, how we live. Sooner or later, our understanding of everything in life changes because we've traded truth for a lie. And everything that is true and normal in our lives starts to be corrupted and changed. And why is that? And the answer is very simple. Because once you turn from the eternal, objective truth of God and embrace a lie, our lives and our culture are no longer moored to eternal, objective truth. We've chosen the lie. And the result of choosing the lie, trading the truth for the lie, means that in all of our lives and in every area of culture, this lie is going to pop up in different ways. Last week I shared with you that as you look across our country today and our culture, there are 10 great lies that pervade in every part of our society. In the government, in social media, in education in many ways, in so many different areas. Let me remind you again what the 10 great lies of our culture are. The first one is that God is irrelevant. You can follow Him if you want. If you don't, it doesn't really matter. After all, we really don't need God. He's okay if you want to have somebody to pray to. At least you can identify this thing or person you're praying to, but it's not necessary. God is irrelevant. The second great lie, because God is irrelevant, all religions are the same. Ultimately, even if they teach opposite things, as long as you're a good person in whatever faith system you're a part of, you're going to get to heaven if it even does exist. But all religions are the same. The third great lie of our culture is that people are inherently good. Now, we may make some poor choices at times, but it's not that we're sinful. We are inherently good people. Which leads to the fourth great lie of our culture, and that is that truth is relative. Now, this is really significant because we used to understand that truth was objective, not subjective. That there was one truth, and you could have lots of different opinions, but only one truth. But that's not true in our culture anymore. In the postmodern world, that's probably best represented by talk radio. In talk radio, you used to have one person call in, he's got an opinion, somebody else has a different opinion. There were lots of opinions, but it all ultimately boiled down to there was still, in spite of all the opinions, one great truth. But in postmodern radio culture, talk radio culture, now everybody's opinion is equally true. Even if it contradicts something that somebody else may say. Your truth isn't objective, it's subjective. And if you believe it to be true, it's true for you. And this concept of truth being relative is seen across every spectrum of life. With faith, everybody's truth is just as valid and real as anybody else's. So for the Christian, his truth is that the only way to heaven is through Jesus. That's fine, that's your truth. But for the Muslim, his truth is that Allah is going to receive anybody who believes in the writings of the prophet. For somebody else whose religion may be absolutely opposite of what we believe, their truth is just as real and just as valid as ours. It pervades every area of faith today. But it's not just faith issues or opinion issues. It's also started impacting the way that we teach facts of science and math. It used to be that truth being objective, you had math, you had science, you had one truth. But that's not the case today. And let me just pause and say, I'm going to get a little political here, so you're just going to have to embrace it, all right? Look, today in many of the democratic states where they've introduced and now are adopting DEI positions, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Math and science is not taught as an objective reality, but a subjective reality. That means that if I said over here, what's 2 plus 2? You guys would all shout, 4! Okay. But then I look over here and I say, what do you think 2 plus 2 is? And over here they all shout, 3! I look over here and say, what do you guys think 2 plus 2 is? 5! In today's world, there are 3 right answers, not one. And in California, Washington, Oregon, this whole plan is already in place. It's going to start sweeping east, and you're going to see Democrat state after Democrat state adopting the DEI proposals for education. Because in their minds, to teach truth as objective rather than subjective, as objective instead of relative, that's racist, and that's judgmental, because everybody's truth is equally valid. The fifth great lie that's taught in our culture is that climate is what's going to ultimately determine our future. And let me just be clear, the Bible tells us exactly how all of this ends. It's not climate, okay? But We all see what's happening, and I'm going to come back to the climate issue in just a few minutes, but the climate is what, in the eyes of most of our culture, now determines the future of not just us in America, but all of mankind. The sixth great lie of our culture is that personal happiness should be the goal that we're all pursuing. After all, our Constitution guarantees us the right to pursue happiness, right? And yet we forget that when Jefferson wrote the Constitution, the word happiness meant something different than it does today. 200 to 300 years ago, the word happiness implied a sense of contentment. It was the Old Testament concept that everyone would sit under his own vine and fig tree. That as an American, you had the right to pursue this life of contentment and completion. But today, the word happiness isn't about contentment, it's about personal pleasure. And so today, Americans believe that we have the right to pursue personal pleasure any way that we want to. The seventh great lie of our culture is that gender identity is fluid. It isn't that there are just two sexes or two genders. Gender identity is fluid. And if you look online, you'll see the most common expression of this is that there are 77 different genders. And some of the articles online will go up into the hundreds. And frankly, I don't know how you keep it all straight if there are 70 different genders. But this is considered to be absolutely true. In spite of the fact that all other truth is relative, we have to accept that there are multiple gender identities. The eighth great lie of our culture is that all sexual activity is normal, it's healthy, it's good. All right, this goes back to number 6 that says you have the right to pursue happiness any way that you want. And if part of that pursuit of personal pleasure is in the sexual realm, then that means that whatever you do and with whoever you do it with is just as good and healthy and normal for you as somebody else's expression would be for them. So that means it doesn't matter whether it's heterosexual, homosexual, adults with children, or even humans with animals. As long as it brings you pleasure, sexual activity, regardless of how it's practiced, is healthy and good. The ninth great lie is that abortion is health care. We identify it as health care because we want to keep the focus on the mom rather than the baby. And in many democratic states today, you can have an abortion in the 3rd trimester, and some, like Virginia, have even decided that you can have not just a 3rd trimester abortion, but in the name of health care, the baby can be aborted the day before it's due. And there's even discussion of saying the infanticide issue is health care. It's still post-birth abortion is what they would call it. It's just crazy where we are as a culture today. And then the last lie is that races are superior to each other. We've seen this tragically in the American history in the South, where you had all the Jim Crow laws. We've seen the KKK influence as white people thought they were superior to black people. We're seeing it today in a reverse sense with the DEI and woke theologies that are being taught. And now they teach that white people are inferior to black people. And it is a religious structure for them, as we'll be talking about in a moment. Everything that we've seen going on over the last month with all of the riots and disruptions about pro-Hamas versus Israel, it's all the same argument. Races are superior. And in all the demonstrations that we've been watching across college campuses, the prevailing thought is that Israel and Jewish people are inferior to the Palestinians. And this is the world that we live in. This is the world that our children are growing up in. Now, let me tell you, and I said this last week, and I never, as I was planning this message out, I never thought that this is the one that would show up on Mother's Day, all right? But I'm glad it did, because the greatest challenge that we have is looking at our kids and our grandkids and saying, if this is the world that they're going to grow up in, how are we supposed to help them as parents or grandparents? How are we supposed to help our kids navigate the challenges of a fallen culture that is manipulated and controlled by the lie? Now, you have to understand that there are how you're going to answer this depends on which of two completely opposite worldviews you embrace. There is a secular worldview that is at the heart of all of these 10 great lies, and there is a biblical worldview that specifically points us to God's answers to these issues. And if you're asking somebody how parents are supposed to navigate this culture for their kids to somebody who is a secularist, somebody who embraces the secular worldview, they would tell you that there are three answers. The first, and an easy way to remember the three answers that the secularist will give you, or the person of our culture will give you, or all three words start with the letter F: fear, flow, and follow. Fear, flow, and follow. The first one is fear. We are to be afraid today to have kids, and you will not believe how many people in their 20s now believe that we should not have kids, or that we should limit them at best. There are 4 reasons why the secularist says we need to be afraid and we shouldn't have kids. The 4 reasons are because of climate change, because of overpopulation and diminishing resources, because of crime, and because of the rising costs of having kids. Now, the climate issue is bigger than most of us realize. Let me just be clear here. I'm not a scientist. I don't know how much climate change is real. But for an entire culture, not only here in America, but globally, there is at least the overwhelming perception that if the temperature goes up because we've harmed the ozone layer by using fossil fuels and all the rest of it, if it goes up 1.5 degrees to 2 degrees, then civilization will die. And as a result of that, over and over, you see articles like this. And this study was done by the University of Bath. 40% out of 10,000 people surveyed believe that today it's wrong to have kids because of climate anxiety. This is unbelievable. Article after article. This opinion is everywhere. I'm telling you, everywhere. I wish I could just keep showing you article after article that shows this is the prevailing thought. Now, even if some would say, hey, that's really high, 4 out of 10, 40% of young people say we shouldn't have kids. Even if that statistic is high, it is still communicating a message that is gaining steam around the world. And it's not just climate anxiety. The whole thing about overpopulation and a lack of resources for people was seen in an article, and I want to share this with you because this is one woman whose name is Angelica Salazar, who is expressing exactly what thousands and thousands of young people around the world are saying right now. The highlighted section is her conclusion. And she says, by having children, we would be exposing them to the suffering and pain of living in such a world. We often question whether it makes sense in a crowded world, 9.7 billion people by 2050, according to the United Nations. Whether it makes sense in a crowded world with depleted resources to do something that seems more like a must-do than a real choice. She's saying that in the past, it was just expected. When you get married, you're going to have kids. But now we need to move away from the must do to make a concrete, conscious decision. At the very least, we should have the courage to ask whether we really should continue having children. And it's not just climate anxiety or the loss of resources and booming population. The cost of having kids is so astronomical that people are saying, don't have kids. Just don't. The answer is don't have kids. Until this year, the average cost of raising kids was in the $250,000 range. The most recent number from the Brookings Institute is that to have a kid today and be able to pay for his needs or her needs until they're 18 is $310,000. Wow. I mean, that's a lot of money, especially if you have 3 or 4 kids, right? And you're looking at this going, how do we do this? $310,000. And it is a big amount. And that's exactly why for the last 30 years, I've been saving every receipt. And for all 3 of my boys, I have saved, whether it's their food, clothes, or utilities, and I am now withdrawing that from their inheritance. And I'm going to enjoy it now, all right? But this is the answer the world gives us. Be afraid. Don't have kids. And this is so sad because the Bible is clear to the believer, to the Christian. And in Proverbs 29, Solomon writes and says, fear is a trap. Fear is a trap. But if you trust in the Lord, He's going to take care of you. You're going to be safe. I don't have to worry about all those climate issues, the overpopulation issues, even the rising costs. If I'm a Christian parent and I'm following the Lord, I'm bringing my children up in the knowledge of the Lord, God's going to take care of me. And He'll take care of you. So the first response of the secularist from their worldview is, don't have any more kids. The second response from the secularist is that if you're a Christian parent, you just need to go with the cultural flow. The way that they express it is, you just need to learn to be tolerant. Tolerant. You can be a Christian if you want, but just keep it to yourself. Don't talk about it. Don't tell people. Because if you start talking to people about faith issues, it's just going to be irritating. And even more, if you try to fight the flow of culture, then you must hate everybody. Now, this is ridiculous. Rick Warren has answered this objection about people saying, just because we don't agree or we're not willing to go along with the cultural flow, that we're haters, when he writes and says, our culture has accepted 2 huge lies. The first is that if you disagree with someone's lifestyle, you must either fear them or hate them. The second lie is that to love someone means you have to agree with everything that they believe or do. And then he concludes by saying, both of those positions are absolutely nonsense. You don't have to compromise convictions to be compassionate. Right now, the cultural voice has been saying, Christians, you can believe anything you want, but just don't make waves. Don't talk about it. Just be tolerant. But here's the problem. That position, just like truth is relative, has morphed into something greater. The concept of tolerance is changing right now. And where it's leading us is that it's not enough to believe what you want and just be quiet. You have to follow it now. You have to embrace it now. This week, I was reading just an incredible article in a magazine called The Conservative American. And in this particular magazine I was reading, there was an article called Christian Parenting and Culturing by a guy named Rod Dreher. And Rod Dreher writes and says, in this whole issue of what tolerance in our culture means today versus what it meant 10 years ago is completely different. He writes, it's fully accurate and obvious to say that we live in a pluralistic society if we are using the term pluralistic in a descriptive sense. To say it's descriptive is just we're making an observation about it. It's descriptive. We clearly live in a cultural context of religious, moral, cultural, and ethnic diversity. Nobody can argue that. But now everything's changing. All right, can I ask that would be silence, please? All right. Today, however, when kids and parents use the term tolerance, it's something completely different. When we're told that we live in a pluralistic society, the word is used not descriptively, but prescriptively. This is really important. We're not just making observations. To call it a prescriptive observation means that we're expected to embrace it. He goes on, in other words, because there's diversity of worldviews, opinions, and moral convictions, after all, and here we go with the great lie, no one can claim to have the truth. Of course, all of this is accepted prescriptively in the name of tolerance and inclusion. Then he caps it off with this, and this is the real thrust. He says, now being tolerant doesn't just mean you recognize or observe differences. Being tolerant now means agreeing, endorsing, and being forced to participate in the celebration of a lifestyle. It's not just rolling with the flow, it's embracing the flow. And eventually, fully reordering all of society. We're going to go along with the plan and we're going to share in it to change everything that we once understood as normal in a Judeo-Christian world. And now we're going to fully embrace and help bring in this new culture. We are going to reorder all of society so that all who refuse and won't accept and are intolerant are going to be purged from both polite company and public life. Do you understand what he's saying? If we're not willing to fully, not just tolerate, but fully embrace culture, there's going to be a price to pay. There's going to be a price to pay. And before you say, oh, Steve, you're so extreme in this. Are you kidding? It's already happening, folks. Over the last year, we've seen more change in this area than any other period in history, in American history. Today, conservative parents or Christian parents, if they speak out, are isolated and labeled. We're called right-wing extremists and haters. Last year, the Department of Justice arrested conservative Christian parents who even dared to speak out at school board meetings. And they were labeled as domestic terrorists. And it's not just we're odd or we're terrorists, but now there is a strong force within the Democratic and ultra-left wing of the party that says Christian parents, conservative parents, actually need to go back to school to be deprogrammed from our conservative and Christian values. And we need to be re-educated. Wow. This is where our culture is going, and we're already on the path. So is there any hope for us? Is there any hope for the Christian who says, hey, I want to honor God. I want to honor God not only in my personal life, but in my parenting and in my family? And the answer is yes, there is hope. There is hope for us. And in the same way, there is a cultural worldview that is secular and anti-God. There is a biblical worldview as well. And there are biblical answers for Christian parents today. How do you help your kids navigate all the lies of our culture? There are 3 answers in the biblical realm, just like there were 3 answers in the secular realm. The three biblical answers are know the truth, live the truth, and grow in the truth. Know the truth, live the truth, and grow in the truth. When we think in terms of what it means to know the truth, folks, we have to educate ourselves. We cannot stick our heads in the sand. We must recognize that these two worldviews are real. This is what's going on every single day around us. And the only answer to the secular worldview that has its lies that permeate every part of our culture, we need to know as believers what the biblical worldview of parenting and family is. And there are 6 foundational pillars to the biblical worldview of family. We don't have a lot of time to go through it, but I just want you to be aware. These are the 6 pillars of what it means to have a biblical worldview regarding family issues. Number 1 is that God established and blesses biblical marriages. In Genesis 2, God established marriage for every time period in every culture. He blesses marriage as it's followed, male and female. God created them. God brings them together. God established and God blesses biblical marriage. Number 2, the second pillar of biblical worldview of family is that children are a gift from God, who is the creator of life. It's not just a biological event or even accident. Children are a gift from God in Psalm 127. And God is the creator of life. And it doesn't matter whether it happens naturally or with medical help. God is the one who gives life. And God is the one who says, these children that I'm giving you are a gift. The third pillar in a biblical worldview of family is that parents have the responsibility, not the government, not the educators, but parents have the primary responsibility to guide and provide for their children's development and growth. Ephesians 6:4 places the responsibility of bringing up Christian children in the knowledge of God squarely on parents. And when we send our kids to school, regardless of what kind of school it is, when we send our kids to school, we aren't abdicating authority and saying, okay, they belong to the state, they belong to the teachers' unions. We are simply saying we are using you to help us fulfill our God-given mandate. And by the way, I just want to pause and say, I am so grateful for Christian teachers who are willing to take on that burden and challenge. Today, they're fighting against the flow. And it is a challenging one. And I've talked to different people who are teachers here, especially in Illinois and others where there is more of a DEI influence than what we might see in Indiana. But I am so grateful that Christian teachers are faithful and they're salt and light in the environment that God has put them in. And thank you so much. And so go ahead, clap. It's okay. All right. Now, All right, the fourth great pillar of the biblical worldview of family is that as stewards of life, and this is an important phrase, in the same way that I'm a steward of my finances, I'm a steward of the time that God gives me, in this area of life and creation of life, as stewards of life, couples are guided by God alone, not by our culture, not by the government, not by popular opinion, even within the Christian community. How many times have I seen this? And I just want to cringe when a large family comes in and somebody goes, oh, you've got a lot of kids, as if it's something that's wrong. Listen, the responsibility of parents is not to say, how many kids can we afford? What does our culture think? How many kids are appropriate and convenient? But the responsibility of Christian parents is to go to God in James 1:5. If you lack wisdom, ask God. He'll show you his will. And you say, God, how many children do you want us to have? We're going to be obedient and faithful in whatever size family you choose for us. All right, I'll let you think about that one. All right, and then number 5, the fifth pillar is that Parents, Christian parents have to model faith and biblical values to their kids. I love Deuteronomy 6, where Moses is writing. God's telling him, you tell parents they're to write the truth on their doorposts. They're to tie it to their foreheads and their arms. Everywhere they go, they're supposed to be talking about it, modeling faith and biblical values to their kids. That's the way that God wants us to live. And then the last great pillar of the worldview, Christian worldview of family. And this may seem odd that it be included, but this is absolutely critical. Children are going to be blessed by God when they learn to honor their parents. In fact, in Ephesians 6, Paul points out this is the first commandment with promise that God gave through Moses. And kids need to learn to honor mom and dad. Because not only are they honoring mom and dad because God gave their parents to them, but it also establishes a pattern for how they are to honor authority figures in every other area of their life. Okay? We have a responsibility to know the truth. Now, this whole woke DEI mentality that is consuming our culture may seem strange and foreign to you, and you're saying, I don't even fully understand it. Let me give you two resources that I encourage you as Christian parents to read. One is Erwin Lutzer's book, We Will Not Be Silenced. The other is Fault Lines by Voddie Baucham. And both of these books will help you understand that what's going on in the culture with woke theology and ideology, this is not just a passing social phase or a fad. These teachings of the DEI woke involvement in a culture are theological in nature. They are spiritual in nature. And both of these two books will help you understand that more fully. But for parents and grandparents, as you're trying to say, how do I help my kids or grandkids navigate this culture that we're living in? There are two books that I would recommend to each of you. And the first one is A Practical Guide to Culture. And I know you can't read it, but the subtitle says, Helping the Next Generation Navigate Today's World. The second book is Mama Bear Apologetics. The subtitle to that is Empowering Your Kids to Challenge Cultural Lies. Both of these books were written to help Christian parents understand how to teach truth to their kids in a culture that is saturated by the lie. And folks, let's be clear. It's not enough just to know the truth. You have to live it out in your home every single day. Your kids are going to know whether Christianity is real and true because of the way they watch you live. We all know that as parents, there are three different types of parents. You can be an absentee parent and you're never there. The kids are on their own, and that is the most unhealthy form of parenting. The second is much better than absentee, to be engaged. At least you're asking questions. You're finding out what they're learning. You're watching their social media to know where your kids are at in all of this. But again, even that's not enough. It's important to be engaged, but to really have a healthy family, a biblical perspective, you need to be strategic as parents. What does strategic parenting look like? Let me just share two thoughts on this. Number one, a strategic parent is someone who has an intentional plan. An intentional plan for prioritizing spiritual growth, even while we're managing all of the demands of our culture on our kids today. Now, look, it is not my purpose at all to hammer on the issue of sports, because parents like for their kids to be involved in sports or band at school and other events. But the challenge that we have in our culture is that all of this stuff is happening on Sundays now. Now, I'm not suggesting for you older Dutch folks that we go back to the days when you went to church, you had lunch, and then you took a nap. And you didn't get, if you were a kid, you didn't get to ride your bike, you didn't get to go out and play. You never went to a restaurant, right? Kids grew up in that kind of environment, but that's gone. Let's just be clear, that's gone. Today, most of the events, social events for kids, whether they're academic or sports, are happening on the weekends, and most of those are on Sundays. Now, I don't want to be the hammer. You need to be involved in church. But let me just say, just as emphatically, if your kids are involved, and we have families who from the 1st of May until the 1st of October are gone because of all their kids' events. All right, I'm not saying you can't do that, but what I am saying is you need to be intentional in terms of finding a plan that says, okay, if our kids need to do this, how are we going to make sure that they are also growing spiritually? And it might be saying, okay, if you're involved in sports, you're still going to be going to the youth group. Or if you're involved in these school events and we can't make it to church, as a family, we're going to be watching online. And we're going to still get spiritual feeding for our family. This is what intentional, not just engaged, but intentional parenting is all about. You are guiding through all the landmines and the challenges that say somehow we're going to make sure our kids are growing up spiritually healthy. The second observation about strategic planning and parenting is not just saying, okay, it's good for our kids, we'll make sure that they're growing one way or another, but parents, the challenges that we're dealing with today and grandparents are dealing with, we have never seen in our culture before. Never. And you can't do it alone. Let's just be clear. You can't do this alone. This is exactly why 2,000 years ago, with all the challenges of the culture back then, that the writer of Hebrews said, don't stop assembling together, because even more as the culture is falling apart. And the same thing is true today. Christian parents need to be connecting with each other to encourage each other, challenge each other, help each other in the cultural and spiritual issues that impact our families. And that's what leads us into the third. That is, be a part of a growth community, a community of faith, whether it's a small group here at church, wherever you're able. Most of us are familiar with the African proverb that says it takes a village to raise a kid. It's simply saying parents can't do this by themselves. It's a big issue, and we all need to help each other. So can I take this proverb and just change it a little bit? Instead of saying it takes a village to raise a child, it takes a village. It takes a village. And here at Village, we are so committed to this that we're starting a new Bible study for parents of preschool kids. And we're going to be going, starting next month, in the first and third Mondays of June, we're going to have a Bible study here at the church for parents with 0 to preschool kids. And they're going to be going through the Mama Bear apologetic books. And Jason Sinwelski is going to be leading that study. And for preschool kids, we're going to do the same thing when Awana starts up on Tuesday nights. For parents of school-age kids or grandparents who are dropping kids off at Awana, instead of dropping and head home, we're going to invite them to stay and be a part of this Bible study, this group. And we want to make a difference. We want to be engaged and helping, intentionally helping parents as they're navigating the field. All right? Now, folks, let me be clear, and I need to pull all this together. The answer is not to withdraw. Total withdrawal. That's what the Amish do. And there's no salt or light impact that they have if all you're going to do is cloister away. God says to Christian families, don't withdraw from the culture completely. God is using Christian families to still be a spiritual and cultural salt and light influence to our world. He wants you to be salt and light. God is using us to help others find their way back to Him. That's what this is about. But as I do that, as a Christian parent, as a Christian grandparent, who's still involved and engaged and intentional about leading my family, I want to have a life that characterizes what Joshua said. Joshua didn't write this when he had little kids. He was an old man near death. He's looking at this as a parent, a grandparent, maybe even a great-grandparent. And he is challenging everyone, saying everyone has to choose what they're going to follow. Everyone's got to make a choice. You're either going to follow the gods and the values of this world and culture, or you're going to follow the God of the Bible. And as for me and my family, we're going to serve the Lord. We're going to serve the Lord. That's the commitment that God is asking you to make. My prayer is every one of us will say, that's the life I want to live. That's the life I want my kids to have. And I'm going to ask you to bow your heads.